FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
Welcome, and you are listening to the Financial Survival Network. I'm Kerry Lutz. Today is 9/9/2020, which probably means something numerologically, but I have no idea what. Well, you've probably been wondering, you've been reading the stories for nearly 4 years now about what is really going on in the Trump Whitehouse. Most of the books have been downright negative, demonstrating a White House out of control, basically a White House where chaos rules. And yet so much has been accomplished, so much has been done, and so much is still to be done and happening. Well, we've got with us noted author Doug Wead. And Doug, you've written 30 books. I'm not even going to attempt to recount them here, but books on presidents, on the Bushes, on Reagan, on the Iran crisis, on so many different issues. So to have you on here, to get somebody who really is someone interested in the facts, is really an honor, and we appreciate it. And we want to get your feedback out there. So what do you think? Is Trump a chaotic madman or a genius? What is really going on in the White House? And just email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. So Doug, you wrote this book about the Trump White House. You got pretty much unrestricted access. What's your take on it all?
Yeah, I have to tell you, Kerry, going into it, I had worked in the White House and had a pretty close friendship, very close friendship with 2 presidents, but a pretty close with 5 presidents. And so I suspected that a lot of this, what appeared to be chaos, was calculated going into it based on my own experience, but it was far more than I ever dreamed. Trump uses chaos. Sun Tzu was erroneously attributed to have said, out of chaos comes opportunity. But that, whether he said it or not, that surely describes Donald Trump. He blows up NATO and the national media goes crazy, and he rebuilds it bigger and better than ever before, comes away with $90 billion that we wouldn't have otherwise had. And NAFTA, he blows up NAFTA and rebuilds it. So this is typical Trump, and he's been extremely effective in doing things that have just sat dormant for 6 presidents in some cases, and surely for the last 3 presidents.
All right. So it's interesting that you quote Sun Tzu, because I'm not going to give you an exact quote, but Sun Tzu always said, when you're strong, act like you're weak. When you're weak, act like you're strong. And I think the entire news media, the polling establishment, the political infrastructure, polling companies, consultants, all this, they looked at the current election as Biden's to lose. And in fact, it was really Trump acting weak up until the convention, acting very vulnerable and very uncertain about getting reelected. And all of a sudden, that all turned around. Am I perceiving that correctly?
I think you are. Kerry, I've spent my whole life in the establishment, the Republican and Democrat establishment. In fact, I've come to the conclusion they're very much alike, both of them. Almost 40 years in the Bush family. And I came away very disillusioned with it. I welcome Trump's iconoclastic, outrageous. He's moving the cheese. He hasn't totally ended corruption, but he's forcing them to find new ways to steal money. I'm referring to some of the big monopolies that multinational companies that tend to run the world. And so I'm very impressed with what he's done. I'm not surprised by the opposition. These big monopolies own the media. Viacom owns CBS, Disney owns ABC, on it goes. They all have at least 40% of their income coming from China, some of them 70, 80% connected directly or indirectly through China. So, of course, they don't like him. He's released small business, the angels of small business. That's what's driven up the stock market. That's what caused all the hiring and the new jobs for poor people. It's the diminishing of regulation, which the monopolies use to keep the small businesses from competing with them. And here comes the Democrats. They've shut it down again with COVID-19. You notice Costco's not shut down. Yeah. Target's not shut
Walmart.
down. They're still running.
Amazon,
But the mom and dad stores are all shut down.
Funny how that works. So you've had access to both parties. Like you say, they're pretty much one and the same, the uniparty, as some have referred to it. What about, from your experience, Doug, the whole concept of the deep state, which sounds very ominous and very undemocratic? In your opinion, does it exist?
Yes, I experienced it and saw it all my life. Years ago, I encountered it. What I learned is that a conservative is not attracted to government. A conservative, he opens a hardware store. He starts a restaurant. He goes into business. A liberal tends to believe that government has the solutions to help people, so they're drawn to government. So what I saw in a Republican administration is that almost everybody who wanted a job coming into a conservative Republican administration were liberals. And they filled the bureaucracy. So it didn't matter whether a Democrat won or a Republican won. You'd get a few conservatives here and there, but they were isolated and outmaneuvered by the so-called deep state, by the bureaucracy, which is by its nature extremely liberal, socialist. They believe government has the solution for answering people's problems, and so some of them are quite sincere. Most of them are just corrupt
opportunists. And it's so fascinating to see what Trump did. For instance, it used to take 10 to 20 years to get a highway approved or a road project, whatever it was, because you had to get all these consultants in, environmental impact statements that went for thousands of pages. And he was at the Department of Transportation, and he showed just one file, and it was like 20 or 30 feet high worth of paper. Considering that we don't really use that much paper anymore, that was pretty astounding. And Trump just cut to the chase. One person is in charge of a project, and they shepherded through the process. He cut the size of environmental impact statements down to, if it's direct government action, I think it's 150 pages. If it's just an approval of private action, then it's 75 pages. So there's hundreds, maybe thousands of consultants who would be the Sherpa to guide these projects through the bureaucracy, who are basically out of jobs now. And that's just one instance. And really, that kind of sums up Trump's strategy, doesn't it?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by your story there. That's good. I got to capture that. And there's so many of them. I asked him about NAFTA. I said, they say you're not a real conservative, that a real conservative would be for free trade. He said NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA is 17,000 pages long. The Bible is 1,000 pages long. And what it means is that nobody on earth has ever read NAFTA. They've just read their 10 pages or their 20 pages that their corporation wrote or their trade organization wrote or their lobbyist wrote. And it's filled with corruption. It doesn't take 17,000 pages to spell free trade. So he, again, like NATO, he blew it up, he rebuilt it. Canada likes it better, Mexico likes it better, America farmers likes it better. But the large monopolies and corporations who had it stuffed with money coming their way don't like it, and they want to get rid of him.
Mm-hmm. Yep, no doubt. And there's all these entrenched interests. And we know from Schweitzer's books that basically Congress has been bought and sold. And we have one person standing up to the entire onslaught. And what about the way they're constantly attacking Trump, belittling him, ridiculing him, and totally disrespecting him? Trump seems to have a pretty large ego from what I understand, and I've met him a couple of times. How does he feel about all that? How does he keep going on?
Well, he said to me, and you know, Kerry, I interviewed him and all the family, Ivanka and Jared. Some of my best interviews were with Jared Kushner, who was just unavailable to everybody else. I interviewed Tiffany. I'm the only journalist to have interviewed Tiffany Trump since her father was elected president. And of course, Don Jr. and Eric and Laura, they're just fascinating. He said to me, "What can I do about it?" So he's just a gutsy guy, and he knows he's getting the tar beaten out of him. And it's funny. They told me a story, and my book is filled with these personal stories. But they told me one night at dinner time, Melania was being attacked for no other reason than just pure jealousy. And she just was hated by some of the women who run the fashion magazines and won't feature her, and who cringe at all the mail they get irate over the fact they don't feature her. And so Melania was feeling bad, and they sat down to dinner, and the president said, "Melania, honey, isn't this wonderful, this adventure I'm taking you on? You're the first lady. If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't be the first lady. Aren't you grateful?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much."
She doesn't seem to be real thrilled. I don't think she signed on to be First Lady of the United States. And I mean, she's along for the ride for sure, but she doesn't seem too thrilled about it.
You know, she's got tremendous poise. And I was so impressed by, remember when she went to that school and they booed her, these little children, they were junior high children, and the teachers and the school authorities arranged for all these children to see the First Lady, and they allowed or even encouraged these children to boo Melania Trump. And she just stood there and was so gracious and kind. I was deeply impressed by that. It made the schoolgirls look bad. It made the school look bad. She looked great. She just has dignity and poise, and she just remains above the fray.
Hey, so when we look back on the Trump years, eventually we will, and you know, this is assuming he wins a second term, which I firmly believed from the day after he won the first term that he'd win the second. Just the odds are in his favor. What are we going to think of when we think of Trump?
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next.
With multi-million ounce potential at its Yellowknife District project, Gold Terra is a company on the move. You'll find them at goldterracorp.com, and their ticker on the OTC is TRXXF. On the TSX, it's YGT. The management team is headed up by near legend Gerald Hanaton of Detour Gold fame, who's convinced that Yellowknife's potential is far greater than its current 735,000 ounce resource. The mine benefits from great infrastructure. Employees can pick up breakfast at Tim Hortons on the way to work. And there's multiple high-grade discoveries, putting Gold Terra on track to reestablishing Yellowknife as one of the premier gold mining districts in Canada. And that should do wonders for the stock price as well. So head on over to goldterracorp.com and sign up for their notifications now.
The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.
I believe personally, Kerry, that Donald Trump is going to be a huge figure of history, and part of the reason for that are all of the so-called fake media. I mean, Russian collusion. You got to stop and think if the Russians anticipated Trump would be elected president, the New York Times did not, and they recruited him as a spy and they got him elected. It's one of the greatest events of world history. It's like the landing of man on the moon. It's the equivalent of Christopher Columbus crossing the ocean. It's the assassination of Julius Caesar. So 200 years from now, historians are going to come rushing back to what? He's a Russian spy? How did that happen? He's going to be so colorful and so interesting. So the more they try to hurt him, I think the more they ensure that he's going to be etched very, very deeply in history. He'll be just as colorful in 300 years as he is right now. And I got one quick story. I don't know if you have time.
Yeah, please share it with us.
Okay, this is something that you're not going to hear anywhere else that I have personal knowledge of. The generals come in with him. They're sitting down. He's going over line item by line item the cost of the Afghanistan war. He's outraged by the amount of money it costs. And he gets to this line of billions of dollars. And they say, well, that's the Afghan army. We are paying for the Afghan army, but it's a good deal because we can train them. We buy their uniforms. We tell them what to do, where to go. They're our army. Our men don't have to die. We own this army because we pay for their salaries. And Trump kind of muses at that for a moment, and then he grumps and he says, what's their names? And the generals say, pardon, sir, pardon? What's their names? Well, there's 200,000, Mr. President. This is a huge army, and we pay the salaries of all 200,000. Yeah, well, who are they? What are their names? Oh, I see. Yes, sir. Well, we'll do an audit. We will do an audit of these 200,000 soldiers. So they run an audit, and in the first pass, they find that 100,000 soldiers, half the Afghan army, full paid salaries, all through Bush and all through Obama, and they didn't even exist. That was money going down a rat hole of corruption to people all over the world on the receiving end. That's typical of what Donald Trump finds.
All right. And along those lines, so I wrote an article shortly after he was elected entitled The Workaholic In Chief, because we really hadn't had a workaholic as president, arguably since Nixon, maybe LBJ. And, Trump gets like 4 or 5 hours a night of sleep, and then he's off to the races. So the media really can't keep up with him. They can only concentrate on 2 or 3 things that he can do in a day, but he's got to be doing dozens of things. What is your experience with that?
Well, I asked Ivanka about that and Jared about that. And Ivanka said, this didn't happen overnight. She said, when I was a little girl, I'd be playing under his desk. And every morning he'd get the newspaper and he'd rip it apart. It was before the internet. He'd cut out pages and he'd paste them onto cardboard and he'd file them into filing cabinets. And he's been furious for years. He's been upset, first over the drain of money to Japan and then China, and outraged at how America has just been screwed all over the world. Our American middle class pays for high-speed railways in Germany, beautiful airports in Italy and in France, while they're descending into poverty in this country. He was just outraged for years. So when he became president, I had a wonderful interview with Jared Kushner, who describes the first day. When he was president, the first day, he wanted to do everything. The staff, their heads were just spinning. He wanted to end ISIS today. He wanted everything to be done within 24 hours. And you're right. You described it very well. He's a workaholic, no question about it.
Yeah, and the media really... they can concentrate on a couple of things, but he's doing dozens of things every day, reshaping things. And the media is either unable or unwilling or both to report upon it and to really tell you what's happening here. Because, the one thing I know he hates more than anything is the waste, the theft like you described. The fact that the taxpayers being ripped off, the fact that our money is just being wasted, probably half of it, whether it's the military budget, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, you name it. The government's just being taken for a ride. How, from what you've witnessed, Doug, and I should mention, and what you've recounted in your book, Inside Trump's White House, the real story of his presidency, from what you've seen there, how is he fighting waste? Because we've got all these new programs since the pandemic. Money is just being handed out left and right, and fraud is sure to follow.
Yeah, what I've seen about that, Kerry, is Bush, who I knew very well, both of them had traveled with George W. on private planes and commercial planes and car caravans and presidential motorcades, and knew him and know him very, very well. Of all these presidents, Trump's he's a different animal. He's for one thing, you said he works harder, and there's no question about that. And the corruption just irritates him. He can't stand it, and he's got to do something about it.
Yeah. I mean, when he was building his buildings, whatever you think of his business practices, he knew how to keep a handle on cost, how to squeeze the subcontractors. I remember when he got elected as president, the first thing he did was sit down with the president of Boeing and renegotiate the Air Force One acquisition. And, you're charging too damn much here. And, let's face it, when you're a government contractor of any stripe, if you're big enough, you have a license to steal from the government. That's the reality of it, right?
That's good. Yeah, and I remember that so well. And I asked him about that story. I've got a great story in the book about that. Boeing came in and he said, "Hey, you guys gave $1 million to the Clinton Foundation, and you maxed out your contributions to Hillary Clinton among all your executives at every level. You bet on the wrong horse, didn't you?" He said, "I'll look at your Air Force One, but it's going to have to come in at a much lower price, and it's going to have to be done a lot sooner if you're going to get it." And today, Kerry, some contracts that Boeing used to get without any challenge, they now have up to 40 competitors bidding for the same contract. That's the difference between Donald Trump and a Republican or Democrat normal president.
Hey, I'd like to see him address the change orders, because we know the way that they really screw the taxpayer, these contractors, isn't so much from the contract itself, but then poor government planning, and then they just do it themselves. You got these change orders, and then they can charge whatever they want for the change order, and there's nothing stopping them because it's not counted within the contract. So I wonder how he's dealing with these change orders.
Yes, I do too. And it's interesting. I look at it this way. Bush bailed out the banks. Obama and Biden bailed out their buddies like Lysandra and others. Trump is bailing out the people. He was sending checks. When you brought up the fact he's got this big budget now with the federal government, I think he was born for COVID, because if it had been a liberal Democrat, they would have tilted and leaned to the public sector, let government take care of this. This is too big. If they were a Republican president, they may have hesitated to put the government behind it. They'd say, this is a private, let the labs do this. But Trump did both. He's non-ideological, and he used government immediately, and he set the labs that Obama had tied up with regulations. He set them free to start looking for vaccines immediately, lifted all the FDA restrictions. So it's a very interesting time, Kerry.
Yeah, it certainly is that. Well, we really do appreciate you coming on, Doug, and providing your insights and your personal experiences and stories, because we just don't get enough of that, because everybody has an agenda out there with all the books and articles and everything else. He's definitely the most written about, most controversial figure in my lifetime. And we've had some real controversial ones like Nixon, like Clinton, like W. So the book, been out a while. You should take a look at it. Inside Trump's White House, The Real Story of His Presidency by Doug Wead. I'd love, you got more than enough material for another book here or an update on this, Doug. I would love to see it in light of the experience, perhaps after his reelection, which I believe is imminent.
Thanks, Kerry. It's great being on your show. I love your show.
Hey, well, thank you so much, and really appreciate you coming on. And the stories are just priceless, Doug, and the stories alone are worth the price of admission. And any questions or comments for Doug or myself, email us, kl@kerrylutz.com. Twitter feed @KerryLutz, our main site, financialsurvivalnetwork.com, which we've revamped. Join our gold contest. Guess the price of gold by September 25th at high noon. And if you're closest, you'll win a half ounce of gold. Doug, thanks so much for coming on, and we will definitely talk to you again when you write your next book.
Thanks, Kerry. Keep up the good work.
FSN Radio. It's all about what's next. Go to financialsurvivalnetwork.com and sign up for your free weekly newsletter. You'll also get 3 free reports. The Financial Survival Network. It's all about what's next.